There is a pattern in history that ends global systems when they are weaponized, not weakened. Weaponized. It has happened before. Trade systems, payment systems, reserve systems. Each time the system was presented as neutral. Each time leaders said access was guaranteed. Each time participation was sold as safety. And each time the moment access was used as a weapon, the system began to fracture. This happened to empires built on trade routes. It happened to gold-based systems. It happened to colonial clearing systems. In 2014, it happened to the modern global currency system. Not through collapse, through demonstration. For the first time, access to the core financial system was denied at scale. Not to criminals, not to individuals, to entire banks, to entire countries. This was not policy. It was proof. Proof that money was conditional. Proof that reserves were not sovereign. Proof that participation did not mean protection. From that moment, the system changed. Not overnight, but permanently. Countries did not announce exits. They did not declare rebellion. They did something quieter. They began preparing alternatives. History shows what happens next. When a neutral system is weaponized, trust does not return. It fragments. First slowly, then structurally. We have seen this sequence before. Every time access is controlled, parallel paths emerge. Every time parallel paths emerge, the center weakens. Today, this process is already visible. Trade is moving outside the dollar. Reserves are being diversified. Payment systems are being duplicated. Not because of ideology, because of risk. The numbers confirm it. Global reserves are shifting. Bilateral trade is rising. Sanctions are expanding, not shrinking. This is not prediction. This is pattern recognition. 2014 was the trigger. What followed was inevitable. Once money is used as a weapon, it stops being a common language. It becomes a liability. And when that happens, fragmentation is not a choice. It is the outcome. It is mathematically impossible for this system to remain neutral once it is weaponized. We are already inside the pattern. Not at the beginning, in the middle. History shows this pattern clearly. 6 stages. Always the same order. Always the same ending. We are now in stage 3. And history shows that stages 4, 5, and 6 follow with precision. Not emotion, not politics. Precision. The only question is how the reset happens, not whether it happens. There are only 3 outcomes. 1, inflation destroys the currency. 2, a forced jubilee wipes out creditors. 3, war destroys enough of the system that the debts stop mattering. Before showing how this played out before, one concept must be clear. Debt jubilee is not optional. It is not kindness. It is not ideology. It is math. A debt jubilee is the cancellation of debts across an entire system, not because governments want to, because they must. When debt reaches a level that cannot be repaid, something breaks. Either the debt disappears, or the economy does. There is no third option. Debt is a claim on future production. When you borrow money, you promise future work, future output. When governments borrow at scale, they make the same promise. But future production is limited. When interest payments consume all growth, the system locks. New debt only pays old debt. Nothing new is created. At that point, the system becomes circular, self-feeding, unstable. The math becomes undeniable. If the economy grows slower than the debt, repayment becomes impossible. Not difficult, impossible. When that moment arrives, the debt must be eliminated. Not refinanced, not delayed, eliminated. History shows only 3 methods. Inflation, jubilee, war. There is no fourth path. Every major debt crisis ends this way, without exception. This sequence always begins the same way. Stage 1. Credit expansion creates the illusion of prosperity. Borrowing feels like growth. Spending feels like wealth. Leaders point to activity as proof of success, but it is future value being pulled forward. Ancient Rome, 10 to 30 ad. After the empire stabilized, credit exploded. Lending expanded across every class. Public works were funded by borrowing. Private lives were funded by borrowing. Aqueducts, roads, forums, all built on credit. The elite competed to spend more, not to produce more. Games were funded with borrowed money. Political power was bought with borrowed money. Trade expanded. Luxury flowed into Rome. The city looked prosperous. But the growth was hollow. The borrowing did not create new productive capacity. It funded consumption, spectacle. By 20 ad, private debt was everywhere. Even wealthy families borrowed just to keep appearances. As long as new credit existed, spending continued. The illusion held. This is always how stage 1 looks. Medieval Europe, 1300 to 1340. After agricultural expansion, credit spread rapidly. Banks lent to kings, nobles, merchants, and churches. Trade grew. Construction surged. Cathedrals rose across Europe. It looked like prosperity. It was leverage. Stage 1 always feels like success, and it always plants the seeds of collapse. Italian banking houses became the engine of European credit. The Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Medici. They lent to kings. They lent to nobles. They lent to merchants. They lent to the church. Credit moved upward. And when credit moves upward, risk becomes systemic. Kings borrowed to fund wars. The 100 Years' War between England and France was largely financed by Italian loans. Edward III of England borrowed more than 1.5 million florins from Italian bankers. That sum equals billions today. The credit expansion created visible prosperity. Trade expanded. Cathedrals rose across Europe. Universities were founded. The system looked healthy. But the debts were compounding underneath. Kings were borrowing to repay earlier loans. Interest consumed future revenue before it existed. The Bardi and Peruzzi banks had lent so much to monarchs that a single default could destroy them. They were exposed to sovereign failure. Revolutionary France followed the same path. After the wars of Louis XVI, France was deeply indebted. The solution was not restraint. It was more borrowing. Louis XVI borrowed to fight wars in Austria, Poland, and the 7 Years' War. Louis V inherited debts consuming half of government revenue and interest alone. The economy looked fine. Paris was the cultural center of Europe. The nobility lived in excess. Versailles held endless celebrations. Credit kept flowing because everyone believed France could always borrow more. Germany repeated the pattern after World War I. The Treaty of Versailles imposed 132 billion gold marks in reparations. An impossible sum. The government borrowed domestically to make payments. It borrowed to rebuild. It borrowed to avoid raising taxes. At first, it worked. Unemployment fell. Production increased. But the growth was borrowed. It was future output being promised twice. The post-war Western world followed next. From 1950 to 1980, credit expanded faster than ever before. The United States issued housing, education, and business loans through the GI Bill. Europe received Marshall Plan aid, much of it structured as credit. Growth surged. Living standards rose. Borrowing was cheap. The prosperity felt permanent. But this was still stage 1. Borrowing that feels like growth. And stage 1 always leads to stage 2. Stage 2 begins when debt passes a critical threshold, around 250% of economic output. Beyond this point, growth slows. Resources shift from production to debt service. Ancient Rome, 30 to 33 AD. Private debt reached crushing levels. Senators owed more than they owned. Merchants could not repay loans. The entire economy was leveraged beyond its ability to produce. Medieval Europe, 1340 to 1345. Edward III owed more than his kingdom's annual revenue. France owed similar amounts. Italian banks faced defaults greater than 10 times their capital. Lending stopped. Rates spiked. Revolutionary France, 1788. Interest consumed 60% of government revenue. Borrowing costs rose. Confidence broke. Germany, 1921 to 1922. Total debt exceeded 400% of GDP. Reparations alone dwarfed economic output. The government borrowed faster than the economy could grow. Stage 2 was complete. Modern global economy, 2008 to 2020. Debt crossed 250% of GDP in 2010. Instead of falling, it accelerated. By 2022, global debt reached 350% of output. The United States crossed 320%. We are deep into stage 2. Stage 3 follows next. Interest consumes all growth. And when that happens, the trap closes. Wealth was flowing upward, from debtors to creditors. But debtors had no way to produce enough to pay. This is the moment the trap closes. Medieval Europe, 1345. Edward III of England stopped paying his debts. Not delayed. Stopped. The Bardi and Peruzzi banks had lent more than their entire capital. When the king defaulted, the banks collapsed. The Bardi failed first. The Peruzzi followed. The credit system froze. There was no replacement. Italian banking was the backbone of European finance. Without it, international credit vanished. Trade collapsed. Interest on remaining debts consumed royal revenues. Growth stopped. Revolutionary France, 1788. France was spending 60% of government revenue on interest. Not on defense, not on administration, on interest. The state borrowed only to pay interest on old debt. This is the debt trap. Louis CV called the Assembly of Notables. He asked for new taxes to save the system. The nobles refused. They were the creditors. They would not pay to rescue the state. The king tried to force it. The result was revolution. Germany, 1922 to 1923. Reparations, domestic debt, and reconstruction costs exceeded revenue. Payment was impossible. The only option left was printing money. The Reichsbank ran the presses without pause. Inflation began slowly, then accelerated. Prices doubled, then doubled again. Savings were destroyed. But the debts remained. They were denominated in gold. In real terms, the burden grew even as the currency collapsed. Modern global economy, 2020 to 2025. The United States now spends roughly $900 billion per year on interest, more than defense. At current rates, it approaches $1 trillion annually. At historical rates, it reaches $1.5 trillion. Real economic growth adds maybe $500 to $700 billion per year. Interest consumes all of it. Every new dollar of output pays old debt. This is stage 3. The debt trap. We are here now. Check. Stage 4 follows. Recognition. The moment the math becomes undeniable. Rome, 33 ad. The Senate forced creditors to invest in land. It failed. Debtors were jailed. Prisons filled. Elite families were exposed as insolvent. They owed more than they owned. The Roman elite was bankrupt. The debt could not be paid. Medieval Europe, 1347. Kings tried restructuring, extensions, partial payments. The math failed. England earned $100,000 per year. It owed 9 times that amount. Creditors accepted reality. The loans would never be repaid. France, 1789. Debt consumed all tax revenue. The numbers were public. Even total shutdown would not solve it. The system was insolvent. Germany, 1923. Trillions of marks printed daily. Bread cost billions. Workers rushed to spend wages before value vanished. But debts were still due in gold. Everyone knew the truth. Repayment was impossible. Today, the math is public again. The United States would need trillion-dollar surpluses for decades. Global debt exceeds 3 years of total output. The numbers do not work. This is stage 4. Recognition. Once recognition spreads, pressure builds. Stage 5 begins when debt can no longer be ignored. Debtors demand relief. Creditors demand protection. The system cannot satisfy both. History shows what follows. Rome erupted. France revolted. Germany destabilized. Today, pressure is building again. Left and right demand intervention, forgiveness, relief, protection. Governments respond, but no policy fixes the math. Stage 5 always leads to stage 6. Reset. Not through repayment, through erasure. Ancient Rome, 33 ad. Debt threatened social order. Emperor Tiberius released 100 million sesterces as interest-free loans. Debtors used state money to repay private creditors. Private debt vanished. Public debt replaced it. The treasury drained. Relief was temporary. Within decades, debt returned. Later emperors chose another path. Currency debasement. Silver in the denarius was steadily reduced. Debts were repaid with diluted money. Creditors were paid, then robbed through inflation. Method 1. Inflation. Medieval Europe followed no policy at all. The Black Death killed up to half the population. Debtors died. Creditors died. Records vanished. Labor became scarce. Wages rose. Feudal debts dissolved with the system itself. Method 3. Destruction. Revolutionary France tried again. Paper money backed by seized land. At first it worked, then printing accelerated. Prices exploded. Currency collapsed. Debts disappeared. Savings were wiped out. Germany, 1923. The pattern compressed. Trillions printed daily. Money lost value by the hour. A new currency replaced the old. The slate was wiped clean. Post-war Europe, 1953. A different choice. Negotiated jubilee. Germany's debts were cut in half by agreement. Creditors absorbed losses. The system reset. Method 2. Jubilee. Different eras. Different tools. Same result. Now map the stages to today. Credit expansion? Complete. Debt beyond threshold? Complete. Interest-consuming growth? We are here. Political pressure? Visible. Reset? Pending. History is clear. Debt is not repaid. It is erased. The most likely reset is not sudden collapse. It is slow erosion. Persistent inflation that never fully retreats. 10%. Then 15%. Year after year. Debts appear paid. Currencies lose value. Savings shrink without being touched. Selective cancellations follow. Student loans, restructurings, partial jubilees. Quiet, targeted, normalized. The reset is not announced. It unfolds. This has happened before. Again and again. Not because of failure, because of math. Debt reaches a level it cannot be honored. The promise breaks, and the system resets the only way it ever has.